Great. So thanks, everyone. My name is Cassie Halls. I'm with the Shared Use Mobility Center. We're a not-for-profit based out of Chicago. And today I'm going to be talking about shared mobility as an equity strategy and looking both locally and globally at the potential impacts of shared mobility. So I'm not going to cover all of these, but as you all know, there are a lot of looming changes coming within our transportation system. And a lot of these are encouraging new modes of transportation like shared mobility. So for example, we're seeing a rapid growth in downtown cores, and we're seeing people who maybe aren't as interested in having a car, maybe instead in multimodal, flexible transportation options. But along the other side of that is we're seeing greater suburbanization of poverty and increased job access challenges, people who no longer can afford to live in the city. And we're also seeing, even though with climate change there's huge infrastructure challenges, we have less and less money to spend on fixing our infrastructure because of traditional funding is like gas taxes and licensing is going down in revenue. So a lot of challenges, but it's looking positive. With innovation, I think that we can address all of these. So to start off, what is shared mobility? So everyone defines shared mobility differently, but at the Shared Use Mobility Center, we define shared mobility as anything from public transit to ride sharing to car sharing, where you have a car that you can check out for a couple hours, short-term car rental, taxis. And we see this mobility hub concept as also shared mobility. So kind of the physical manifestation of a phone app where you can walk up and there's all the services available at a hub. And we see public transportation as kind of the apex predator. So it's really the backbone of everything. It's the first thing that you go to, and all these other modes feed off of that. So we're also seeing a huge rise in shared mobility in North America and in the world. For example, in Chicago, where I'm from, there's now a bike share system that's over 6,000 bikes. In New York, we have a 10,000 bike and growing bike share system. And we're seeing all these emerging groups like Uber and Lyft that are now in 350 cities worldwide. We have new models like peer-to-peer car sharing, where you're renting out a car to your peers, get around services like that in multiple cities. So it's a really exciting time to be in this area because it's growing so rapidly. And a fundamental shift that we're witnessing is a shift from vehicle ownership, where everyone understands mobility as something that you own and something that you access because it's yours, to something that is used, like Airbnb for a car, basically. So you're just checking out a car, whether it's you're sharing it with someone else and paying a very low fare, or maybe you're checking it out for the day. There's all these new services that are arising around this concept of usership over ownership. So what is a Shared Use Mobility Center? We are a not-for-profit that's making it easier to live well without owning your own car. And the way that we achieve this vision is that we connect public agencies in transit, community and private sector to scale shared mobility and extend the services to all. We're serving as a clearinghouse to do innovative research, and we're also creating a toolkit for cities, a policy playbook, among other tools. We're providing technical assistance for cities to facilitate city learning, and we're convening public and private sector partners in workshops and conferences. And what we're most known for is our research around transportation network companies, so Uber and Lyft, and public transit. And what we found is that this relationship is not as competitive as people think. It's more complementary. So we found that the more people use shared modes, the more likely they are to use transit, own fewer cars, and spend less on transit overall. So this was a report that came out last year that was really groundbreaking in the field in terms of how do cities deal with Uber and Lyft. And we also found that people who use 3 or more shared modes, which we coined super sharers, report greater transportation cost savings and own half as many cars as people who use transit alone. So It's a pretty big deal in our world. And everyone's defining equity differently. So how am I talking about equity? How are we talking about equity? We're looking at indicators such as economic, social, environmental indicators that of things such as a third of annual household incomes of low-income households is spent on transportation, which is a huge amount of money, something that needs to be alleviated. And then 2/3 of US jobs are not even accessible by public transit. So the odds are against a lot of people here in terms of our transportation ecosystem. We're also looking at indicators like climate change, which is a leading cause. The transportation sector is a leading cause of emissions in the world. And climate change is also disproportionately affecting the poor. So it's very negative impact there. And then we're looking at disparities in terms of land use and transportation options across ethnicity, gender, and ability. So how can shared mobility be an equity strategy? In terms of what we're doing, we're piloting new mobility services through creating public-private partnerships. So partnerships between transit agencies and other public sector people, and then also with Uber, Lyft, and other private mobility providers. So I'll talk a little bit more about this later, but this is one of our tenets of our work. We're also facilitating knowledge exchange across cities to learn about best practices for filling critical transportation gaps. So whether it's first last mile solutions, how do you get from your house to a transit stop? Late night shifts, if you're working 2 jobs, how do you get home if the bus doesn't run? And transportation such as paratransit, which is for disabled populations as well as seniors. And then our last equity strategy is changing how we evaluate and measure success within transportation funding. So how can we shift the way that we measure success in these programs, and how can we create more programs that support more of a shift in the paradigm of what transportation can be. And then in terms of impacts, we're looking at if we're able to be successful in this, we're able to alleviate poverty, we're able to alleviate and make cities more livable, and increase public space for shared options. So the impacts could be great. Okay, so to drill down into the strategies a little bit. So I mentioned before that we're piloting new mobility services. We have 2 key programs we've done since we've started. And one is about to kick off, the Los Angeles Low-Income Electric Vehicle Car Sharing Program. It's the same as in Paris. There's I don't know why it's moving. Autolib, it's called Blue LA, and it's launching in LA in the next couple months. And it's all electric, and it's station-based, so you pick up a car and you could drop it off at a different station, but it's one way. And we're really excited about it. It's gonna have a huge impact on the city of LA. And we also have a peer-to-peer car sharing program in Chicago, which our role within the program is to make sure that this service is offered within low and moderate income communities. So that's been really interesting. It's wrapping up, our role in that it's wrapping up, so we'll have some interesting research from that. And then in terms of our second aim, which is facilitating knowledge exchange within emerging public-private partnerships, which we call P3s across sectors. We're involved in a federal grant program called the Mobility on Demand Sandbox Program, which granted 11 cities last year with a small amount of money to test new mobility options. So our role within that is to create an innovation knowledge accelerator, which is focusing on city learning and how cities can share what they've experienced in these programs, what problems they've had, and troubleshoot them. And the types of P3s that we're noticing are trends within these programs, and that the FTA is defined within the program are first last mile, multimodal, app payment integration, carpool ride sharing, and then multiple other types of P3s. And just to draw out a couple examples, we're seeing really interesting solutions arise to filling these critical gaps. For example, Pinellas County, which is outside of Tampa, it's a relatively lower density county, and their buses stop running at 9 p.m. So if you're working swing shift, there's no option for you. So they partnered with Uber to offer this service called the late shift. So you can take like a $2 or $3 Uber ride and get to your house if you're transit disadvantaged. So it's a huge, it's really taken off and it's been really successful. So that's definitely a best practice that we'll be communicating in our Innovation Knowledge Accelerator, which is actually, it's just beginning. So it's an exciting time to talk about it. And then another example is our Scoop partnership in San Francisco. So we're helping, so Scoop is a carpooling service, and they partnered with BART in San Francisco to, instead of building a larger parking lot, they said, let's incentivize people to carpool by giving them a parking spot. So it's a really innovative solution. And then the last tenet here is changing how we evaluate success. So we've been involved in helping develop new metrics to measure success in transportation spending, such as defining mode shift goals. So, for example, in the city of Seattle, they implemented a transportation demand management program that offered subsidized transit passes, car share cars, and many other aspects. And they found that the downtown population, although it grew rapidly, the daily SOV trips, so single occupancy vehicle trips, actually stayed pretty constant. And we saw a decrease in 30% solo driving. So a huge increase in transit. So this, we call this mode shift goals because it's people shifting from solo driving to other options. And we think this is a really important metric for governments to use in order to say this is a valuable project. It's not just reducing congestion by building a huge road. It's also, it's a program that, it's a metric that's defining how cities can measure success that maybe is difficult to measure. Okay, so in terms of impacts, it's one thing to have an app and such as Uber, and implement that app in a city, but it's another thing entirely to actually have the fabric of the city change. So that's something that we're really working on. It isn't something that's really existing yet in the US, but this is our long-term goal. The idea of something like an integrated mobility hub where we can have within a city, all of these services be accessible, and there be educational kiosks and other amenities like EV charging and bike parking. This is a model that exists in Europe, especially in cities like Munich. There's a housing unit where they have a mobility hub on site, and it's been widely successful. It's something that could be implemented very easily in the US. And I know that certain in the Bay Area especially, they're looking at siting mobility hub type structures within affordable housing units. So it's a really interesting development that I think is going to take off. And there's many other infrastructure changes that can happen within cities to encourage shared use. So we're helping prioritize cities building BRT lanes, building parking lots that can be transformed to other things, creating dedicated street space for car sharing, all the positive things that we can put in our cities. And then lastly, we're promoting sustainable cities by modeling what the impacts could be from single programs. So for example, we have our Los Angeles car sharing system, and at scale, we're predicting that 7,000 car share members countywide could take 1,000 cars off the road and could take over 2,000 metric tons of CO2 emissions out of the atmosphere. So it's a huge impact that could come from a relatively small program, and I think this could be on a large scale, could transform the way that we live. And then we have a couple other tools that I'll go into more in the next slide, but this is one tool called the benefits calculator that we have on our website. And you can type in a city and you can model the impacts of just a 2% mode shift. So for example, in Ann Arbor, I just put in Ann Arbor and put in 2%, and if you look at the results, it's pretty huge impact. So what's interesting about shared mobility is maybe it's a small portion of our transportation ecosystem, but it has these potentially huge impacts. And then if you go to our website, we also have a couple other tools you can use. We have our action plans, more research reports of what I mentioned, and also our reference guide for shared mobility. So feel free to peruse that. And I know most of you are students, so if you can use these tools, that'd be great. Thank you so much.